Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. It's just about 9 o'clock. We're just going to give it another 2 minutes to get everyone signed on and we'll get started. Thanks for being here today. All right, it's 9:02. I think we'll go ahead. Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Diana Felton. I'm the state toxicologist with the Hawaii Department of Health, and I work in the Hazard Evaluation and Emergency Response Office in our Environmental Health Administration. Really appreciate you joining us today to talk about climate change and its potential impacts on environmental chemical contamination and what that means for risks to both humans and the environment. I want to take a moment to acknowledge some of my colleagues that have participated and really helped with some of this work. Iris Vanderzander, Roger Brewer, Phoenix Grange, Isaiah Kayla Pacheco, and Marcia Mealy have been really helpful and instrumental in doing some of this work. Many of you on the call have also been excellent advisors and consultants as well. So thank you all for the assistance and looking forward to talking about this really important topic today. So you may ask yourself, what is a doctor doing talking about climate change? And it really has to do with what this image shows. This is from the CDC, and it really starts to show how the environmental degradation we expect to see from climate change around rising temperatures, rising sea levels, increasing carbon dioxide levels, and more extreme weather, ocean acidification, how all these things are going to contribute to additional environmental problems that will lead to human health problems. We are all, aware and concerned about the destruction of the planet that's coming, but there's also going to be a lot of morbidity and mortality to both humans and the environment along the way. And our hope is that by recognizing some of these things now, we can put mitigation adaptation measures in place that will prevent some of that morbidity and mortality. So what's not listed on this image from the CDC, which I would put over here, is the potential risk of increased exposure to environmental toxins and chemical contaminations due to the effect of climate change. And that's what I hope to have you concerned about by the end of this talk. And I would argue that should be added on here as part of the sort of climate change and health risk continuum. But it's also important to understand that the concerns that we're going to hear and that we're going to discuss today are really just one part of the overall negative impacts of climate change. There's so many aspects of this already occurring and impending problem that are going to affect every aspect of life on this planet, from the environment to human health to transportation and urban planning and infrastructure. It's really just a massive problem. So, please note that this is just one small part of what we call the big old basket of harm. So here's increased toxic exposures added to this image from the CDC. So going forward, we're going to talk a little bit about sea level rise. So much of our work here at the HERE office is focused on the impacts of sea level rise on chemical contamination, but I want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page about sea level rise. It's a really complex topic. And, one of, some of the causes of sea level rise is, meltwater from glaciers and ice sheets as the planet warms, the thermal expansion of seawater as it warms. But really this question of how much do we plan for, how much is going to happen, is really a huge topic. And, you could hear hours and hours of discussion on this topic as well. And there's been great work done on this topic by NOAA, by lots of, universities, by the Sea Level Center. And, it's all modeling at this point. So it's very difficult to know exactly how much to plan for, depending on what time frame you're looking at, etc. So a lot of some of the work that we're going to talk about today is based on some of the sea level rise viewer from the PAC-IOS, the Pacific Islands Ocean Observing System, and some of these other references that you can see listed on the slide here. And, sort of a general way people talk about is, oh, should we plan for 3.2 feet of sea level rise or 6 feet of sea level rise? Those are some of the markers. But really, it's much more complex topic than that. And in fact, NOAA published a paper earlier this year that talked about, expected sea level rise for the contiguous US on a current path with high greenhouse gas emissions and rapid ice sheet collapse. And, their models showed a sea level rise of about 7.2 feet by 2100. But that was an average, and really, they found that probably some parts of the United States were going to have higher than that and others lower. My understanding from that report is that the projections for Hawaii are a little lower than average, where places like the Gulf of Mexico might be higher. But even so, the same report estimated 6 to 8 inches of sea level rise in Hawaii by 2050. And then experts at Sea Level Rise Center have been quoted as saying 10 to 12 is possible by 2050. So, we don't know exactly how much is coming. We know that some is coming, and it may fluctuate. And, all along the way is going to be increasing hazards, whether, it gets all the way to 3.2 feet by a certain point or not. So I think that's just really important to consider. This is not suddenly at this date we're going to have this level. This is going to be gradual, ongoing, and continuous. So other important things to think about is that the effects of sea level rise are more than just the surface of the sea increasing and flooding coastal areas. That marine flooding is certainly going to be a problem as the surface of the sea goes up. It's going to cover up more areas and flood more areas. But there's also higher groundwater. As the sea level goes up, there's going to be higher groundwater. You will get inundation of storm drains, increased risks of inland flooding, of coastal erosion, which is certainly of concern. And then, of course, the higher intensity and more frequent storm events are certainly of high concern when thinking about impacts climate change might have on contaminated sites and chemical contamination. And I think it's also really important to understand that the impacts are going to be larger to the subsurface than what we see on a lot of the maps. It's going to affect basements and cesspools and underground storage tanks and support for infrastructure like roads and buildings. So it's really, this, again, a complex problem. There's been great work done on this idea through groups at including Shelley Habel and Chip Fletcher, have really done some great work. And I really like this image from one of their reports in 2020. It shows that, not, again, the direct flooding we mentioned, but then also the backflow through storm drains, and then groundwater inundation into, subsurface buildings and other places. So I just think this is a really great way of showing that sea level rise is not just the surface of the sea coming up, and we really have to think about all aspects of it. So, and then in addition, the impacts of the severe storms worse because of all of these water levels being higher already. So really, multiple factors contributing. And going forward in this talk, I'm going to refer to climate change impacts or sea level rise impacts, but please be aware that I'll be really referring to all these potential impacts, from climate change that we anticipate as I go through in this talk. So I know we're all here from different backgrounds, different coming to this approach from different angles. And I really just want to take a moment to sort of talk about how, how these problems intersect with the work that we do at the HERE office and the work that I do in hazard evaluation. So, our mandate here at the Environmental Health Administration at the Hawaii State Department of Health is to protect human health and the environment. That's number one. That's behind everything that we do. And specifically at the HERE office, our goal is, to sort of do all things related to releases of hazardous substances and chemical contamination. So in addition, though, the HERE office becomes a catch-all for any kind of environmental hazard evaluation and prevention in the Department of Health. So we're really looking at things from a fairly broad perspective, and that's really primarily my job, is to look at environmental health hazards and how we can minimize or prevent them. So please keep that in mind as we talk about this, as you may be coming to it from a different perspective. And climate change is such a huge, broad problem. It doesn't really fall into the purview of any particular part of the State Department of Health. And we've taken up this one small part of it, but other parts of the Department of Health are working on other small parts that are a little more probably applicable to their shop. So fortunately, we're hoping to get a more comprehensive strategy of approaching this climate change and health issue within DOH, but that's for a later date. So just a quick review of the types of sites with chemical contamination that the HERE office deals with. We have primarily state sites and military sites. Most of our state sites are redevelopment or legacy, sites of former industrial agricultural areas, legacy contamination at construction sites, certainly airports, harbors, and then we pay special attention to schools, especially those built on prior agricultural land based on the exposure risk to children. And then there's a lot of military sites we're involved with as well. Of course, underground storage tanks have been in the news a lot, but also shipyards and salvage yards. Unexploded ordnance is a big part of what we do, and military airports as well. So just a quick overview. Many of you are here because you read our June 2021 memo, sort of beginning to describe this issue. And that's really, what we're here to talk more about today, some of the things that we've learned since we published that. And I appreciate everyone for being here despite a delay. We meant to have this webinar much earlier, but our involvement in the Red Hill water contamination really delayed us. So thank you for being patient. And, things have changed even in the past year. So you'll see a little bit of that reflected in this talk. So just a little bit about where we're sort of coming from on this for those that don't work here or are as familiar with our work. We manage over 1,000 sites statewide of chemical contamination. And the contamination is generally the results of historical, industrial, and agricultural uses and releases. Because we don't have hazardous waste disposal sites in Hawaii, contamination is often managed in place in a manner that protects human health and the environment, usually by limiting exposure. And what we're concerned about is the effects from climate change and rising sea levels are going to disrupt that previously stable chemical contamination and create new hazards. And of the biggest concern we have are that the movement of contaminants and changing chemical and physical conditions of the contaminants. So, a lot of the current work that is done is considering static conditions, and we really are not in a climate that is static. And that's really the focus of this, is how to anticipate, how to prepare for changing conditions. So this comes from our database of contaminated sites. It's called iHERE. It's a public record. Each green dot on this map over the state of Hawaii here is a site known and or evaluated by our office to have some kind of chemical contamination. There's no delineation here between sites that are small or minor, such as a small amount of lead contamination in the soil from deteriorated lead-based paint, or possibly complex, large industrial contaminant release, an oil spill. There's really no delineation there. So these sites, while a lot of them, some are minor, some are much more significant. So just a closer look at the island of Oahu, where 80 to 85% of the population of the state lives. And you can see a lot of the sites are located in coastal areas. And you also can notice significant concentration around industrial and military areas. So, industrial areas around Honolulu Harbor, Pearl Harbor, downtown Honolulu, Campbell Industrial Park. We have military bases out here in Kailua and up here on Plateau at Schofield. So, but also plenty of other sites around coastal areas all around the island. So this is a close-up of one of the most important industrial areas in the state, the entrance to Pearl Harbor and Honolulu Harbor, which is here, as well as the Honolulu International Airport. And I think this, slide and this image from this map really sort of is the key point, is what's going to happen to all of these contaminated sites as the climate changes, and when they are affected by these sea level rise effects from submersion of the rising sea, groundwater inundation, increased flooding from more intense storms on top of the higher sea levels, and also coastal erosion that will occur with those changes. So in order to quantify and better understand the magnitude of this problem, we took our iHere database and the GIS layers within it, and then we overlaid GIS layers from the Hawaii State Sea Level Rise Viewer from PACIOS, and we used 3.2 feet of sea level rise at that time to do the evaluation. And so looking at this picture on the upper left, the yellow areas are the properties that we have documented in iHere, and those are the outlines of the properties. The white dots are considered centroids, but do not show exactly where the contamination is. So there's possibility that contamination could be just in one part of these yellow properties, or could be spread throughout, and can't really get that kind of discrimination from this, this view, but sort of gives you a show. And the blue areas show just the sea level rising to 3.2 feet and what kind of flooding that would do. So you can see a significant number of affected properties here in Honolulu Harbor just from the rising marine layer. The picture on the right is when we added NOAA's 1% per year chance of flood risk. So 1% per year chance flood is equivalent to what we used to call the 100-year flood. And that's basically a large flooding event that every year there's a 1% per year chance. Of course, as many of you in Hawaii are familiar, we've had a number of 1% per year chance flood events in the last 5 years. So these are certainly happening more frequently and are projected to be occurring more frequently. But as you can see, when we add that layer on top of 3.2 feet sea level rise, suddenly the whole of Honolulu Harbor is flooded. So then the question comes, well, we've established that the contaminated sites are likely to be inundated with seawater. So what? So what happens next, and what do we need to worry about? And these are the two biggest concerns, that there's going to be movement of the contamination, and also that the chemical and physical conditions could change, creating new or higher hazards. So here's some general examples of contaminant movement. So this is a picture of WAIANAE High School on the west side of Oahu. The high school is here, and these are sort of the fields around the high school. The area in red is the site as defined by iHere, our Contaminated Sites Index. And at the centroid here, at this little white spot, this is the WAIANAE High Air Riflery Range. Air riflery pellets are made of lead, and this site was used for air riflery practice for many, many years with no removal or cleanup of the lead pellets. And as a result, there's very high levels of lead in the soil at this location. Currently, the location is blocked off from access. There's an environmental hazard management plan that we feel is effective. And there's long-term plans to remediate the site completely, but our State Department of Education is notoriously, low on funds, and this hasn't happened, and hopefully will happen soon, but it's unclear exactly when. But this site is just less than 3 feet above the sea level, and as you can see, very close to the ocean. So with this map, the picture on the left shows that 3.2 feet of sea level rise projected. And you can see that the water starts to get up into that area of lead contamination. So what will happen? Will it drag the lead into the ocean, exposing marine flora and fauna? I think it's very possible given how low. And then in addition, if you add NOAA's 1% flood risk, as you can see the picture on the right, much more inundation of the area. And is it possible that some of that flooding, particularly with a big storm and a big storm surge off the west side of the island, could bring that lead more into the school area, or could it even flood it across the street and into these residential neighborhoods, creating suddenly, opportunity for lead exposure to children living in this area? I think it's very possible. Another potential example for contaminant movement is the Keahi Lagoon. This is in Honolulu, and it's the site here outlined in red. This area was planned as a public park, and it would have had areas for spectators for outrigger races, and there was going to be some salt ponds that were restored for bird habitat. And the development never progressed, but during a 1994 site investigation, it was discovered that this site had high levels of lead and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, probably from prior asphalt facility and some historical dumping. Currently, we feel that the 13-acre site is not currently a risk because there's not really public access or a way to get into the area. And the contaminants present in the soil are pretty stable and unlikely to move through the ground into the ocean. But the site's at very, very low elevation. It's directly adjacent to the lagoon, and there's areas of stormwater runoff. So sea level rise and increased flooding will likely transport the contaminated soils from this really isolated area to areas with more usage, which could increase the risk of human exposure. And also, these contaminants could easily move right off, this shoal and right into the ocean next to it, exposing coral reefs and the nearshore ecosystem. So of high concern as well for what will happen to this site. And just for a palpable real life example for anyone here living here in Honolulu, this is the Mapunapuna area of Honolulu. It's sort of the go-to place in town if you need auto body repair, and the area is full of auto body repair shops and other small industrial facilities. And this area floods on a very regular basis. This picture was from 2019. This was just king tide flooding in this area, and you can just imagine the types and amounts of contamination in this water. It's really kind of mind-blowing for anyone that's been down in that area. You can imagine how concerning it would be to be exposed to this water. And with this area flooding regularly, these contaminants are going to be moving around regularly. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of the contaminant movement concern. And next we'll talk about changing chemical and physical conditions. So people might primarily associate the risk from historic oil contamination with a risk of seepage into surface water, such as in this picture from the Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor. But there's some other concerns to consider as well when we think about, left in place petroleum contamination in the ground. And really our concern is that there's the possibility for increased generation of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas from the submersion and anaerobic degradation of residual petroleum contamination. So there's significant areas of petroleum contamination in the ground throughout the state, particularly in areas of fuel terminals and airports and heavy industry. And a lot of work has been done to remove pipelines and petroleum throughout the state, but the hydraulic recovery of petroleum has its limits, and we know that there's still widespread residual contamination. And when the subsurface is nice and aerated and oxygen is present, the methane oxidizing bacteria will degrade the petroleum to CO2 and it will be released. But when the area is submerged, particularly with seawater, it creates an anaerobic environment that leads to an increase in methane and hydrogen sulfide production. So that's really the concern when we think about submersion of these areas of residual petroleum contamination in the ground. So let's think about methane for a moment. It's explosive when mixed with the right proportion of oxygen, and in the presence of a spark, can also be an asphyxiant. And it can build up under pavement and move along utility corridors. So it's particularly concerning for highly developed areas with pavement or solid covering because the oxygen can't get through the surface. And so, thinking about utility workers and construction crews, people that are working in confined areas underground, if they don't realize there may be an increased methane level, they create a spark from their construction work, and suddenly you have really likely conditions for a significant explosion. So just to look at this a little bit more in detail, we've done some work comparing methane and vapor and sea level rise. This shows from 2015 to 2020. The top panel shows methane and vapor at a large number of monitoring wells at a fuel terminal in Honolulu Harbor. And the bottom figure shows monthly mean sea level in red and average daily barometric pressure in green. And you can see some correlations with spikes in the methane and vapor at some of the monitoring wells. And so this, and in particular, when you look at the daily low barometric pressure and some of those correlations, it really presents a risk of real concern that there may be increased methane gas generation in the subsurface when the barometric pressure drops, such as typically seen in a large storm. So this is showing a similar idea, but a little more in depth. And the red line here is methane. This is methane in the groundwater from 4 individual monitoring wells at a fuel terminal in Honolulu Harbor. And there's some confounders in this with recovery efforts and mitigation measures, but the correlations are still there. Oh, I was told there's a problem with the slides. Let's see. So we have the old methane slide. How about now? Should be blue and red. Okay, great. So just to start again here, in case that wasn't showing up, the red is the methane in groundwater from 4 individual monitoring wells, and the blue is monthly mean sea level. And this goes from 2006 through 2020. And there are some confounders here with recovery efforts, such as whirlybirds that were placed, as you can see in 2020 here. But this sort of picture, these correlations that we see here, fits with an understanding that effects on methane generation from seawater submersion of a carbon source is probably slow, and maybe even on the order of months, related to the slow growth of the methogenic bacteria. So this version of methane in the groundwater sort of presents a concern with the future anticipation of slow, steady sea level rise, which may not necessarily directly compare to daily tidal fluctuations. And it's especially important when thinking about carbon sources in really shallow soil. And just as a side note, you can see pretty significant effects from the installation of the whirlybirds that really seem to affect the mitigation of the methane in the groundwater, as well as would be expected in the vapors. So that's kind of interesting to see here too. This is a really, between the barometric pressure and the sea level and the submersion, it really creates a complex picture of being able to understand times when we may have increased methane generation. And others have been looking at this problem with methane as well. This is just a couple of papers of other groups that have looked at differences in landfill methane emissions due to barometric pressure, and then also what sea level rise may be doing to some of increased methane production as well. So for a little case study on this issue, we have excuse me, just a sec. For a little case study on this issue, we have, 2 cases I just want to run through briefly about some explosions that occurred in Waikiki. And this was really brought to our attention by an April 4th, 2022 explosion that occurred in Waikiki. And we gathered sort of as much information about this and a few other explosions that may have had methane play a role in it. It's difficult to tell exactly, but wanted to sort of run through and see if we could put some of this together. So the two explosions we'll be talking in depth about are the one here on the right, which was right on the Alawai on April 4th, 2022. And then a second that we were able to recover some interesting information about that was over here on Hobron Street on February 12th, 2017. Fortunately, no one was injured in either of these explosions, but given that Waikiki is on top of quite a bit of large carbon sources, given its prior history as a swamp and agricultural areas, as well as being an area at very high risk for both groundwater inundation and other effects from sea level rise, we thought it would be interesting to take a little bit of deeper look at what the conditions were like when these explosions happened. So this map is just showing, this is a modern day Waikiki map overlaid with a historical map. It's kind of hard to believe that Waikiki was once really both a swamp, and then the marshlands were also used as taro patches and rice paddies. But the areas in blue, in dark blue, show streams, and the light blue were fish ponds, and the green areas were once taro and then rice cultivation. So the white circles show where they're a little bit off on this image. I apologize. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but this one on the right should be on this side of the Alawai, and this one's also a little to the right. So I apologize for that change in the circles there, but just wanted to show a little bit about the history of Waikiki and how, we're fairly certain there's plenty of rich carbon sources in this area that could contribute to methane generation in this kind of condition. So looking at the chemical looking at the chemical conditions and the environmental conditions on the dates of these explosions, this is from February 12th, 2017. We know from the news and fire report that the explosion happened around 4:30 that day. You can see the upper panel here shows the barometric pressure variation, and the lower panel shows the tidal variation. And the vertical green line is the time of the explosion. So at 4:30 that day, the barometric pressure was low and the water level was rising. So if there was methane present in the vapor phase at that point, a falling barometric pressure would have led to an upward movement towards the surface. And a low barometric pressure may have also been conducive to releasing gas from the groundwater. So, and then in the presence of a spark, and if there was sufficient oxygen, this could have led to an explosion. In addition, a rising tide would have led to the gas compression and upward movement of the gas. For the April 4th explosion, the fire investigation report noted the source of the explosion, that it was determined to be an underground electrical vault of some time, and the incident type was arcing or shorted electrical equipment. And from the news report, it was, an apparent underground explosion in Waikiki that left a hole several feet in the ground. So similar to the first explosion, this explosion happened at low barometric pressure and high tide. So is this a coincidence? Does the equipment spontaneously arc and explode, or could there have been, increased methane production from the carbon source underneath this area that then, in the presence of the spark and the arcing equipment led to an explosion? This is a little longer look back. We also were able to find some historic data of explosions in Honolulu Harbor back in the 90s. And this plot shows the sea level peaks at the Honolulu NOAA station. So this is the bottom, both show mean sea level across, and the top shows a 5-month average of sea level, and the bottom shows monthly averages. And the red lines in the lower panel represent the 10 highest daily sea levels measured since 1905. So what you see on this plot, and then on the upper panel, the red vertical lines symbolize similar explosions in Honolulu Harbor and Waikiki as described. So in 1992 was the highest water level, and that was likely due to Hurricane Iniki. But 2017 was sort of when the idea of king tides really became really prominent in Hawaii. And that year we had 4 out of the 10 highest water levels since 1905. So 4 out of the 10 highest water levels since 1905 occurred in 2017. And so in those 2 years of sort of anomalous high water levels, we had, you know, these explosions. So of course it could be a coincidence, but it does make you wonder about possible correlation with these issues. So both areas have significant carbon sources in the ground with the risk of submergence, particularly in these high water levels. So so this is, you know, interesting look and something to track going forward as well. So what can we learn from sort of these explosion incidents and thinking about methane production and sea level rise and climate change effects? So these are correlations and patterns, and knowing how much a role methane generation may have played in these explosions is probably never going to be exactly feasible, but it's really important to think about. And, you know, knowing that climate change and sea level rise may affect methane generation and potential gas migration. We are suspicious that there are high risk areas anywhere there's a large carbon source in a coastal area that's going to be impacted by flooding. Barometric pressure changes and tidal variations can lead to gas migration and increased risks. Coastal areas with extensive pavement and a large carbon mass are especially vulnerable because you lose your oxygen supply from the surface. We really think special attention should be given to potential explosive risks, especially around areas of construction activities, subsurface vaults, or voids where the gases can accumulate. And that may be particularly true after long periods of rain or high water levels. We think it's important to consider measuring gas, you know, the measurement of gases and methane and vapors at different water levels and barometric pressures, try and get more information about this and see, you know, everything's going to be different on a site-by-site basis. So having an understanding of how the gas concentrations and in the vapors and in the water are going to change with different water levels is really important. And really important to evaluate the risks of leaving large masses of carbon-rich contamination in place. So then other ways that chemical conditions may change are important to think about as well. And, you know, there's a group at the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science that has done some really interesting work on how chemical contamination toxicity may change under different physical conditions caused by climate change. So their underlying premise of this group is that the ecological risk assessments of chemicals that are currently done, they use data from toxicity tests that are conducted under standard exposure conditions. And we know that there's going to be variation in water temperature, in pH, in dissolved oxygen, and salinity, and that may impact the toxicity of pollutants, both because of altered chemical fate and transport, and also because of the changes in physiologic response of the end receptor. So the standard toxicity bioassays may not provide enough information to assess the risk of chemicals in a changing environment. So this group started with that premise, and they did an initial study to look at the effects of increased temperature and salinity on the toxicity of certain pesticides to estuarine grass shrimp that are often found in the US Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. And they basically looked at the toxicity of the pesticides with different temperatures, salinity, and ocean acidification. And then they sort of repeated this with other species, other contaminants, and different expected conditions, and basically found that the toxicity increased with, you know, expected climate stress conditions. So they have a large body of work, a large team working on this, a lot of published papers and reports that are all available on the link you can see here. But just really interesting work on how, you know, the contaminants that are already out there may be worse under different conditions that are expected from climate change. So just about to move forward, I realized I forgot to mention in the beginning, definitely going to have a large question and answer time at the end. So feel free to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll definitely address them at the end, and then more can be added then, or people can raise their hands as well at the end. So I apologize for the delay in saying that, but hopefully that was implied. Okay, moving on. So let's think about where we anticipate problem areas that are at higher risk for being increased hazard due to these climate change effects. This is just an initial list, but areas like coastal landfills that, have with leachate and debris that might go into the ocean from coastal erosion. And there's some examples from California here. The Luhui Airport is built on an old landfill, and coastal erosion is, been continuously moving some of that old landfill debris into the ocean. And there's some examples from Northern California as well. Harbors and airports are also of concern, particularly because of the past, historic petroleum releases and pipelines and storm drains. There's examples here that are of local and wider concern. Any area with extensive contaminated fill that's near the shoreline is at risk. We think of Kaka'ako Park and all along the Honolulu shoreline. And then any areas of abandoned large industrial sites or areas that are capped where the contamination is in soil and sediment and may not be of risk under static conditions, but with flooding could really change. A good example of that would be Waikea Pond in Hilo. So that's an area of significant arsenic contamination in the pond and the surrounding soil from a historical Kanick plant. And, that area has already seen movement of a lot of that contamination due to a tsunami back many years ago. So we know this has already occurred due to an extreme flooding event, but is of concern to have recurrence and additional spread of the arsenic contamination. And then, numerous small commercial sites of gas stations, dry cleaners, and any other small commercial sites that may have contamination from activity. So how big of a problem do we think this is in Hawaii? And it's really important to acknowledge that the risks of the impacts from each individual site are really going to vary greatly. Some may have minimal risk with seawater inundation or flooding, but others might have more. And at this method, there's not great methods for broad prioritization, and really is still in sort of that site-by-site evaluation status, but it's certainly something we'll think about. You can see here when we did our evaluation of our iHear database and how many sites overlapped with flooding from 3.2 feet sea level rise, and then the one NOAA's 1% flood zone, it really is quite a number of sites across all of the inhabited islands, not including Ni'ihau, but really, not just something to be worried about on Oahu, but really statewide. So we aren't the first ones to consider these concerns. Certainly others are working on this and have been working on this, and a number of you on this call have been really helpful in sharing your work with us. But I thought I'd just show some of the other studies, and about going all the way back to 2009, people have been thinking about how this might affect both humans and the environment. This is an area in some mines, what's going to happen to metal contamination from mines when you get increased flooding. Groups in the city of Alameda in California did really thorough evaluation of what will happen as the groundwater rises and more flooding occurs. At Hunters Point in California, where they're trying to redevelop pretty significantly contaminated ex-military site, really have a lot of concerns about what will happen to the contamination with these changes. And then the Europeans have gotten in on this as well. This is from the European Commission Science for Environmental Policy in 2018, talking about contaminated arsenic sites and what might happen with flooding. This is from a report in 2009 in California called The Impacts of Sea Level Rise on the California Coast from the California Climate Change Center. This is just a chart of the coastal California counties and the number of EPA regulated sites that they are concerned will be currently are at risk from flooding and then will be with some sea level rise. And so these are EPA affected sites, so including Superfund sites, hazardous waste generators, facilities required to report emissions for the toxic release inventory, facilities regulated under the NPDES permits, and major discharges of air pollutants, as well as brownfield properties. So this doesn't include state-led sites and is likely a pretty significant underestimation of the number of sites that are at risk, but still gives you a sense of, this is big. So EPA has also done some excellent work on getting, starting to think about this, particularly in their Superfund division. They have some great web resources that are shown here and starting to think about vulnerability assessments for contaminated sites due to the climate. This document here from 2018 on the right was an evaluation of the resilience of some of the remedies at Superfund sites, analyzing from the 2017 hurricane season that brought so many severe hurricanes, particularly to the southern and southwest United States and Puerto Rico. So really interesting to look at that evaluation from EPA as well. And then, as I said, great online resources that can help, help you think about different ways that the sites could and remediation remedies could be adapted and managing contaminated sites. This is from EPA's Office of Superfund, their climate resilience technical fact sheet. This is just some of the resources in this fact sheet that really sort of give overall sort of protocol of how to assess the system vulnerability, evaluate it, and then going back and assuring that you have capacity to adapt to some of these problems. So table 2 here that I just showed a small snippet of just shows some ways to think about, if you have submerged or subsurface components and you're concerned about, the listed climate change effects, some of the techniques you can think about for ensuring remedy resilience. So what can we do about this? Our first step is raising awareness, getting people to think about this as one more issue related to climate change. And it's especially important when you're thinking about climate and health, climate and environmental justice issues, especially as so many people living near and at risk for some of these climate change related effects and chemical contamination are in disadvantaged communities. It also applies to economic and infrastructure concerns. And if we pay attention, we can learn from current and ongoing examples of flooding coastlines. So that 2021 memo that I referenced was really our first step at sort of raising awareness to this issue and getting people thinking about this issue. So what can we do about it? Well, in terms of remediation plans, we can incorporate long-term monitoring of this issue into environmental hazard management plans. For newly identified contamination, it needs to be considered in remedy selection. Should probably minimize capping of contaminated soil and debris in anticipated, flooded areas. And for, prior remedies and long-term management of sites, do we need to think about removal or fortification of high-risk contamination? And long-term management of slow releases, etc. So those are some things to start thinking about. In addition, in planning, it can be really important. Sustainability plans, permitting process, redevelopment plans, any hazard mitigation and disaster planning needs to be incorporating the thoughts of what's going to happen to the areas with chemical contamination. This is really a sort of large need for stakeholder involvement and the compilation of experience and ideas need help from environmental experts and urban planners and people that run fuel terminals and wastewater treatment plants and landfills and harbors, and really sort of this broad contribution to better both understand and plan for some of these hazards. So what are we doing at the HERE office? We're starting to work towards developing criteria for high-risk sites to help people prioritize when they really need to be thinking about this. We're working on the development of additional guidance, policies, maybe down the line some regulations to address these impacts and mitigate adverse impacts to the environment and human health. Really getting back to our mandate here to protect human health and the environment. And we want to continue to raise awareness, encourage responsible parties to be proactive in reducing climate change related risks. And the one thing we really can't do is this. This is not acceptable. This problem is coming, whether we pay attention to it or not. And planning and preparedness now will blunt the negative health and environmental impacts down the line and even save money in the long run. So thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And we're happy to take questions. Feel free to put them in the chat or you can raise your hand, and Megan, who's helping us here from Tetra Tech, will call on you and we'll do your best to answer chats or answer your questions. In addition, I have Iris Vanderzander, formerly of the HERE office, here to help answer some of the questions as well.
Thanks, Diana. We do have a couple of questions already, and I'll go ahead and read those before we go to any raised hands. So the first one is dealing with the slides. And it said the slide with barometric pressure and tidal data on April 4th appears to show the data from 2018 or 2019. Was there a typo, or were the low barometric pressure and high sea level rise not the case at the time of the 2022 explosion?
Sure, let me go back to that. I think that was a typo, but let me go back to it and Iris can help me verify as well. Sorry for the, hope I'm not making anyone sick there. I think, is it this one? No, I think they were talking about this one. So I think this was the slide. So these barometric pressures and tidal variations were all April 4th. And this was the 1745, the time of the explosion was in green here. So I think the number past it is actually the hour of the day, not the year. So this is all, this is just a 24-hour time frame. So sorry for not explaining that in more detail.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we have another one asking, are formerly used defense sites, FUDs, also included in the study? And why isn't the military feds cleaning it up? And this is regarding a site in Oahu with storm runoff leading with lead, arsenic, and RXD in stream sediments.
So the military sites are included in the work we did to count the number of affected sites throughout the state. And, you know, as to the second part of the question, I don't know enough details about the particular site to know what the sort of cleanup plans are at this exact moment to comment on that. But with this, you know, this slide showing this slide shows, you know, the numbers of sites, and those do include military sites.
Okay, thank you. The next question, there's a bit of detail here, but it's relating to barometric pressure drop. And it says, given the climatic extremes that climatic extremes are anticipated, it seems that we may observe more extreme BP dynamics. Would this potentially result in higher frequency of upward vapor flux conditions? Should we be tracking intensity of BP dynamics or at least review historical patterns relative to the explosions?
I think that's a great question.
Or
I'm
you can
going to
take
put
that.
Iris on the spot and have her answer that one.
Well, I think, one of the problems is, as pointed out, with increasing storm events, we are anticipating more rapid drops in barometric pressure. So definitely we will expecting to see higher frequencies of that issue and more upward flux of methane. Should we be tracking the intensity of the dynamics? For sure. I think that's one of the important things we got to look at. We got to go back to historical records like we did for Waikiki. Every time we see an explosion, we should see, okay, what were the dynamics at that time point? And also vapor data that the HERO office has. Often we have the date and the time when the samples were collected, like methane data was collected. So it is very important to do that. And going forward, I would recommend to the HERO office to ask people that do vapor monitoring to measure at these different points of barometric pressure and tide, especially in coastal regions.
Okay, thank you. The next question, what role do you see the university UH researchers playing in helping characterize hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and risk assessment? And what could interested graduate students do to participate in and advance this kind of work?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, is the answer, the broad answer. We would love to see some graduate students interested in this work kind of start to think about some of these research questions and try to drill down further into some of these environmental conditions. I would love to volunteer and say that we could, host internships and capstone projects and assist. We unfortunately, this is definitely side work for us. This is not work in our job description or or a part of our sort of mandated regular work here at DOH. So it's definitely done sort of out of labor of love and because of high interest and because we think it's really important. But we are certainly strapped for time. So we don't have the best capability of being good mentors or sort of leading projects, but we, at the same time, we still would love to participate in any projects, designed and led by UH, any way that we can help. Happy to work with graduate students, happy to work with faculty and researchers, anybody who's interested in taking on some of this. We can certainly share our ideas where we think work should go with this. I wish we could do even more direct, hosting and project development, but trying to be realistic about our resources over here. But I love this idea, Aurora, and please get in touch and we can certainly talk some more about particular direct projects to look at each of these sort of individual problems for anyone who's interested.
Okay, great. And we have another question. Honolulu BWS is developing a source water protection program plan to protect groundwater sources. We are asking here for information on contaminated sites to update the 2004 DOH SWAP report maps of potential contaminating activities. Should we be accounting for climate-induced contamination as well?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think yes is the short answer. The question is how to do that, how to account for it, and to what degree. I think there's still a lot of unknowns as far as how far will certain contaminants spread, how will things change, since a lot of that is still sort of in the projection and modeling phase, and we really don't know. But I think accounting for it, thinking about it, and adding it to any sort of preparatory plans, related to source water protection or any other general planning, I think is really important. And happy to assist BWS, and look forward to connecting, Barry.
Okay, those are all of the questions that I see typed into chat and Q&A. Oh, here's another one. Oh, great presentation. Very nice. Okay. If anyone has another question they would like to have answered, please feel free to pop it into chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Will the slides be available?
Sure. We can definitely share slides. Have to figure out, we can either send them out to all of the participants, or we can post a link on our website. I'm hoping a recording of this presentation will end up on our website as well, is the goal. But if you're directly interested in the slides and don't get an email with a link to them, please feel free to email me directly and I'll send them to you. Great. Any other questions? And of course, feel free to reach out if other questions come up. We'd love any ideas, input. This is an ongoing evaluation, an ongoing problem. New information becomes available, it seems like practically every day. So we'll, continue to incorporate public comments, your ideas, all of the above as we, start to make more materials and information that may be helpful in this area. Great. I think if that is all that we have, I think we will stop there. And thank you so much for participating. We really appreciate your interest in this topic and attention to it, and look forward to working with you all further. Thank you.